In a series of videos, I'm going to introduce the viewer to the existence of ISO 17025 and its importance. I'm going to introduce it in bite-sized bits for easy digestion. Just like all matters of learning, knowledge is incremental over time and builds upon previous exposure. In our first video, we answered the question, what is ISO 17025? The next video, we answered the question, why do we need standards? Why is ISO 17025 and policy and procedures and instructions really matter? And then we answered the question, why is ISO 17025 so important to us in forensic science? Just a few days ago, we asked and answered the question, why should the criminal defense community care about ISO 17025? Well, a little while ago, we even examined how ISO 17025 provides a simple method to develop themes for cross-examination of experts. One of the major benefits to the criminal practitioner to the implementation of ISO 17025 is the adoption of universal nomenclature. This will help us out demonstrably with respect to discovery. For example, I'm sure in the past that when you've requested certain documents that we all know must exist in the lab, there is a tremendous amount of hide the ball wherein a request for a specific item is made, but simply because we do not use the particular sui generis language of that particular crime laboratory on that particular day, the crime laboratory feigns ignorance and reports that there is no such document when we know very well it exists. As we all know, some crime labs play hide the ball. It's not so much that the concept behind the documents requested or the data behind the documents does not exist, but rather through our understandable ignorance, we do not know the proper nomenclature to request specifically what we want. The solution for us can be found in ISO 17025 and in particular subpart 4.3 entitled Document Control. Per 4.3, there's a clear delineation between controlled and uncontrolled documents. The difference is this. Controlled documents can be characterized as those documents which once the library disseminates them or the laboratory disseminates them, it becomes the responsibility of that laboratory to seek out those who have a copy of them, collect the old documents, and replace them with the new, most recent documents in order to ensure that the most current documents are in use. Therefore, it would be extremely useful for a criminal practitioner, for example, to obtain a control copy of the policy, procedure, and instructions for a particular type of test. Therefore, in the frequent event that new documents are adopted by the laboratory, it becomes incumbent upon the laboratory, in order for it to keep its accreditation, to seek you out and replace your copy with the most current one. Uncontrolled documents are copies of the policies, procedures, and instructions that exist at a finite point in time when they exist, but they may not be the most current ones in place and in use. A laboratory has no obligation to update uncontrolled documents. Section 4.3, in conjunction with sections 4.13 and 5.4.7, makes a very fine distinction between documents and records. This distinction between documents and records is crucial to understand. Documents include such writings specifically labeled as policies, procedures, and instructions. Records, on the other hand, are those which are generated during the analytical process unique to the test on the sample itself, such as the chain of custody, the particular notes of the analyst, as well as the analytical device output in its raw data form, and finally, the conclusory opinion that is generated at the end that goes to the customer called the test report. ISO 17025, in its attempt to employ universal nomenclature, establishes a clear distinction within the document designation. The subsets of the types of documents are policies, procedures, and instructions. Policies answer the organizational question of why. Why do we do this? Why is this important? As one can glean from this description of what is contained in a well-formulated policy, per ISO 17025 if one were to receive the copy, for example, in a pre-consumption solid drug dose examination. This policy could include some very useful language that has to do with the importance of accuracy, precision, reliability, robustness, and the need to follow the procedures in the instructions in order to obtain a valid and true result. The policy also answers the large institutional question of who has control over the laboratory. In the policy, who has control over the development of the science is clearly defined. Who develops, implements, and monitors the underlying procedure and instructions is also defined. This would be most useful to obtain in order to show bias of the laboratory at an institutional level. On the other hand, procedures are best classified as answering the question of who, what, where, and when. Who in general does the testing? Who has control over the testing? What testing is to be performed? Where is testing to be performed? On what instruments is the testing to be performed? When is it to be performed? Under what circumstances are the specimens to be tested? What priorities are set in terms of the scarce resources of a laboratory? Those are all answered. Finally, there are the instructions. This is where we find the technical aspects answering the question of how do I, as a bench technician, perform the tests specifically in my laboratory using the resources and equipment that are available to me right now. The additional advantage to the criminal practitioner is in the necessity to uniformly document certain parts of the analytical process as well as the methodology and its validation that heretofore may not have been documented in a crime laboratory at all. This is particularly true in the event of such testing agencies such as the DEA. If one has ever dealt with the particular regional laboratory of the DEA and has attempted to discover how a particular analyst analyzes a pre-consumption solid drug dose sample by requesting the standard operating procedure as we used to do, we all know that it is a frequent occurrence that the DEA will respond that there is no such standard operating procedure. Under ISO 17025, section 4.3, if one knows the proper terminology used in ISO 17025, one will now know to request not only the particular instructions of the analysis, but also the procedures in the policy. As such, the DEA will no longer be able to claim its previous position that they do not exist, at least not truthfully, in court. As one can see, if one asks for the standard operating procedures for the laboratory expecting to get information that's best answered per ISO 17025 nomenclature by requesting the instructions of a test, a practitioner will be sorrowfully disappointed in the result and will possibly not obtain the information that's included in the instructions. Hence, the uniform nomenclature is key and necessary to understand. As mentioned previously, the important distinction of what constitutes a record can be found in section 4.13, entitled Control of Records, and it's different from section 4.3, which deals exclusively with documents. Again, records are output from the analytical process as defined above in what we talked about. Section 4.13.1.1 very specifically outlines that not only records of the analytical process and the tests are to be kept, but also the entirety of the records from the quality control measures as well as the quality assurance aspects of the process leading up to the production of the records of the particular analytical test being performed must be kept. This is important as in the past with some laboratories they've discarded calibration curves or the underlying raw data that generates the calibration curves. Now this will no longer be possible per ISO 17025 procedures, if followed. In addition, per section 4.13.1.2, not only are these items to be preserved, but also they are to be stored and retained in such a way that they are readily retrievable. This should end the gamesmanship that the requested items exist, but they are a needle in a proverbial haystack, as has been undoubtedly asserted in the past by laboratories as an excuse not to comply with discovery demands or orders. Additionally, per 4.13.2.1, We will now be able to insist upon receiving the raw data that is generated as a result of any testing and to try to definitively establish complete compliance with Melendez-Diaz and to make sure that dry labbing did not occur, as the provision specifically reads. The laboratory shall retain records of original observations, derived data, and sufficient information to establish an audit trail, calibration records, staff records, and a copy of each test report or calibration certificate issued for a defined period. The records for each test or calibration shall contain sufficient information to facilitate, if possible, identification of factors affecting the uncertainty and to enable the test or calibration to be repeated under conditions as close as possible to the original test. The records shall include the identity of the personnel responsible for sampling, performance of each test and/or calibration, and checking of the results. Further, we find in note number 2 of this subsection, it includes a preferred definition of technical records as the accumulation of data that may include such items as forms, contracts, worksheets, workbooks, check sheets, work notes, control graphs, external and internal test reports, and calibration certificates, customer notes, customer feedback, and also other papers. Finally, section 4.13.2.2 requires that observations, data, and calculations shall be recorded at the time that they are made, not later. Turning towards the specifics of a particular test and a technician's specific performance, internal auditing is addressed in section 4.14.1 and 4.14.2, which requires that when error or deviations are discovered, that the laboratory shall notify its customers in writing. This could be very useful to us for obvious reasons.